Okay, let's just, while they're cranking that up or whatever you do to those things to get the words up, let's just do a lead in from last week. Master Han Shan was talking about practicing and saying even if people are very sincere and start off to connect to their spiritual nature, two issues can come up that lead them astray. One is the over-reliance on the intellect, to think that this is some intellectual exercise, that you can get this through just logic or reading or analysis of terms and words, like it's a puzzle or a mental discursive thought process. So the image that comes to mind is Rodin's The Great Thinker. Are you familiar with the French sculptor Rodin? He's got a famous, well, they're cranking up, they'll probably find that. Look for Rodin. Rodin has, he has this, right? There we go, Rodin. I-N. There you go. I pick one of those. There's the big one in the middle there. That's a good one. Yeah, next one. Right there, yeah. There you go. That, you'll notice, is a perfect illustration of exclusively dependent on words they previously seen and heard. They attempt to wrap their minds around Dharma using intellects. They glom onto ideas and hold them and ponder these things profusely. If you want to look at the contrast to this, look at the sitting image of the Buddha. Okay? So can you draw up a contrasting Buddha image there? I'm just testing, see how good this stuff is. I'm getting to play around with technology, you see. There you go. So take one of the most tranquil images you can get of the Buddha. That's a good one right there. Next one over. Yeah. Now I'll put it next to Rodin. Can you do that? There we go. There's You can't do a couple windows at the same time? We're getting there. Oops, there we go. Well, can't do it, huh? If you look at the contrasting images or just sort of flash back and forth, you'll see actually Rodin's contemplating the Buddha and trying to figure out what is he doing. And the Buddha says, I'm not doing. What? So if you look at those contrasting images, you really see a whole different approach to what we would call learning or insight. In the image on the left, the Buddha image, you'll see that the effort is to bring the body into a posture, a yogic posture, and to center the attention down into the dantian with complete equilibrium. It's an inquiry based on non-attachment, of equanimity, of calm, of stilling the mind. And in the still mind state, then everything becomes to become manifest and clear. So this is called quieting the mind to discover everything. On the right, you have Rodin, who is more coming from a weighty contemplation, a taking of something and then chewing it over, so much so that the head has become heavy with the exercise. And so one is holding up the head, both to show incredible effort and energy, but also to show the weight of that thought of trying to penetrate. And it's a real labor. You can see the labor, but the body postures alone will give you insights in these contrasting ways of inquiry. Okay, so this is just one image. So he says this is a contrasting image. And the next one is, if you're trying to suppress your emotions, you won't get there either. So if you think I can become calm and pure, not by transforming my emotions or seeing my emotions and where they lead and analyzing them and gradually getting free from the knots that one ties oneself in, simply by pushing them down or denying and repressing them, he says this too will not lead to penetrating. And it only leads to anxiety and further delusion. Now we go to the next passage where we're getting into tonight. And he's making a very interesting statement here. Let's just read it. All that we experience is illusory and not real. What we experience in any given moment is a shadowy projection from our true mind. See through it. Focus your attention on one place, the place where experiences arise and cease. Observe their rise and fall. Where did they come from? Where did they go? In this manner, use unrelenting effort no matter what, and we put quotation marks, wrong thoughts, false thoughts, distorted thoughts arise. By holding steady, fast to this, those thoughts, those patterns will disintegrate. Right at that moment, and they use as a metaphor here, the ice will melt and the tile will break. Two different metaphors. The ice melting is the famous one that ice and water of a single substance. In one form it's frozen and hard and stiff. In the other form it's soft and flowing. So too is the difference between fanao, literally confusions or defilements or distortions, and bodhi, enlightenment. It's a single substance. It's just in different form. Fanao, or afflictions, or however you want to translate that, is the ice. And when the light, if you want to use that, the light or the heat of insight hits that, it melts it and becomes water, but it doesn't go away. It's just a single substance transformed in two different ways. The tile will break is a reference to a sudden penetration, a sudden moving through an obstacle where on one side you're obstructed and not clear. The tile breaking is the penetration to the other insight. So he says, absolutely do not allow yourself to be tossed and turned by passing states of mind, nor let them persist in an endless stream. So he's giving he's giving advice here how to work with the muddled thinking and the emotional graspings and negative emotions that are coming up. Don't be turned and tossed by them. Don't allow yourself to be turned by tossed by them. At the same time, don't let them persist in an endless stream. Don't follow them. Don't indulge them. Indeed, he says, this was Master Yongjia, who wrote the famous Song of Enlightenment, means by staunching the flow of the unceasing discursive mind. Do not embrace the floating mind as real. Fundamentally, it is an illusion, or it's illusionary. Okay, so a very rich passage here. He's making a couple of statements. He's saying, in the unenlightened state, the ordinary state, where our minds are just running wild and our emotions are galloping along, that which we take to be the ordinary, normal life, this is not real, it's not genuine. It's a manifestation of our minds confused, of the original mind gone into a state of confusion. And therefore, he says, everything we experience through this frame of reference, everything we experience through this frame of reference is illusory and not real. It's mostly projection, not reception. So we're actually as if, with our thoughts and with our mind, generating a movie that we're projecting out. Now, in the consciousness-only school, or the everything is consciousness, or Iche Weishen's, everything's made from mind alone, this process is really getting into deep Buddhist psychology, but it's saying essentially what we call reality, what we call the world out there, and the world that we experience is not some world that is just generated out there going on as if on a screen, and we are passive observers watching that. But rather, it's an interactive reality, that the world out there that we experience is an interaction between the sense objects out there, the sense organs that are we using to perceive, but most importantly, the consciousness that intermediates between those. And so consciousness directs the sense organs in certain ways to make things out of sense objects that are desirable, undesirable, objects of want or objects of fear, and so on and so forth. And in a very, very subtle way, the whole of our reality, of our unawakened reality, is a projection of this dynamic interaction that's going, he says, on and on ceaselessly. The mad mind, it's called. And when the mad mind's constantly operating, and over time we become so habituated, as it said earlier in the passage, that we actually construct and hold up a reality from day to day, week to week, year to year. Now, sometimes things come and shatter that or challenge that. And we have choices at that point. We can readjust our reality. We can readjust. Someone dies, someone comes into our life. We see them in a certain way. We construct a relationship with them, and we change our narrative, and then we go on. Or we can deny that. We can deny something coming in and push it away and try to hold on to the narrative. And the Buddha was saying that mostly ordinary consciousness is involved with this very active, very busy construction of a narrative in which we're at the center. And in this narrative, we hold it up through habitual patterns of memory, inference, and so forth. Okay, so this is basic Buddhist psychology. It's not absolutely unique, because a lot of the more recent psychology, and even going back a number of decades, has come to very similar conclusions. And I mentioned earlier, also in the area of neuroscience now and consciousness, this is more the active paradigm that they're using, that reality is not something out there, and that we are and they use this analogy like in a theater, in a seat, watching reality on a screen, but in fact it's a dynamic interaction that's going on constantly. And it's different for every person. Even though we feel as if we are seeing and feeling, experiencing the same things, we're clearly not. And when you get into detailed conversation, you realize this. And it's not just a language problem. So what he's saying here is there is an experience, or there is an encounter, or there is a direct scene called bodhi, awakened enlightenment, that isn't mediated through this process. And this clear seeing comes when we're able to recognize the turnings of the mind and emotions, not follow them, not give in to them, quiet the mind again and again until the mind becomes absolutely alert and clear and pure. And then what we experience is the wisdom of a Buddha. And that's what Buddha means. We awaken to things as they really are, as opposed to a sleepy projection, dreaming of the way we'd like them to be, we wouldn't like them to be, and so on and so forth. Sometimes you can see this in a very gross cognitive way as the patterns that hold this together are both neurological and consciousness. But in the neurological way, there's actually synaptic patterns that form around this, that, they call them neural pathways. And once these pathways form, they're just like, on a cracked earth, you have grooves going through the earth, and when it rains, the water just naturally goes to those grooves. So once we establish these pathways, then we set up a construction of me, mine, my world, and so forth. But if you have a neurological accident, now I'm not even talking about a consciousness shift here in terms of meditation or something, you have a neurological accident, some of those pathways get blocked, or they shift, or they break down. So someone who has a head injury can have a memory loss, where they lose short-term or long-term memory, and their identity then goes through a crisis. Or you can have something like the beginning stages of what we used to call dementia, now they call maybe Alzheimer's or something like that. And actually who you are starts to disintegrate. And who the significant people in your life are also start to disintegrate. Now sometimes it's like, I know you, but I don't know your name. And then sometimes it gets even worse, is like, what are you doing in my house? Well, I'm your wife. Your what? It can get that way. It can go for various stages, and this can happen both with aging, but with accidents. It can happen as trauma in war or disease or anything like that. And we start to see what we take to be real and true and solid out there is very subtly held together by these patterns of neurons and neural pathways firing, and being able to retain this with memory and inference. Now, if you take away one way we preserve this is photo albums too. Photo albums is, attempt to maintain a reality of relationships and time and sequence and so on and so forth. But one of the things that the Buddha says is one of the sufferings that happens is that inevitably, invariably, all conditioned things break down. He says all that's conjoined eventually separates. So all these patterns that are put together eventually, through various conditions, will start to disintegrate. And he said, if you haven't cultivated, if you haven't made an effort to see that these are experiences constructed in a way by your thoughts and your patterns, when that happens, you freak out, you panic. And it's intense suffering. And you try to grab and hold on to those various realities you've constructed, and you can't. He said any more than you can pick up water and hold the water in your hand. It will invariably go through or evaporate. So the heart of a lot of angst or sadness or despair has to do with this deep understanding that we have, often don't acknowledge, that everything around us will in turn pass and fade away. We in turn also will pass and fade away. And that much of what we think is real and around us is held together very flimsy way by this bio-neurological, physical, psychic process. Okay? So this is like really powerful Buddhist psychology. And so he's saying, when you meditate, what you're doing in each period of meditation, you're gradually going back to where these patterns arise from. Okay, so what you're doing, that's why it's called the return. Consciousness is returning to itself as it moves out from thought to thought, creating these patterns. And he's saying, in the meditation process, as you sit still and you bring your 6 sense organs in, the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and body, and so forth, you will be able to observe the field, or this matrix, from which everything starts to fire up and come forth. And if you're patient and you watch this, you'll say, you can go back and watch where it comes from and where it goes. Where do they come from? Where do they go? You observe their rise and fall. So he's saying these are not hard and fixed things, but this is a pattern, like a song repeating itself. They arise, they stay for a while, they fade away, and something else comes up, and it's this constant thing. Buddha said it's like waves washing on a shore, one after the other, one after the other. And so you're watching, where does it arise and where does it fall? Watch the conditioned dharmas rise and fall. And with a calm, impartial mind, as you watch this, you begin to see that these are patterns that are self-generated, and that if you don't give into them, you don't yield to them, you just merely observe. You don't repress, and you don't follow them, but you do the third option of just watching them rise and fall. And in that pattern of watching them rise and fall, you start to get liberated from this habitual pattern, this constructed world. So it's a really interesting, and it's a very simple process. It sounds very simple. But of course, they rise and fall so quickly, and there's so many patterns that it becomes like this immense tapestry that's intertwined, and it takes a little while. But eventually you can get to it. So he says, sound the alarm, stop the flow right where it rises. Now he's using a verbal metaphor. Shout. With one shout, immediately, call it. Do not try to suppress it, or you'll be controlled by it, like a gourd swept along by a stream. So he's giving a very, this is what, this isn't just meditation. This is what you do when you cultivate your consciousness to break through and see things clearly. So there's a lot of self-reflection going on here. A lot of observing of your own thoughts and feelings as they rise and fall, where they come from, where they're going. Any questions on this? I'm sure there are, yes.
So you've hung around with some enlightened beings.
Have I?
Told us stories of them. Like, in what way would reality seem different to you?
You asked this the last time, too.
No, I know what I asked. That was a different question.
Okay.
Can you think of any
No, you don't remember, so your memory's going.
Okay, perfect.
So,
Can you think of any instances where you've been with someone who has greater insights than us average folks, where they're seeing reality in a different way than you, like specifically in the moment?
I think the most obvious way for me is someone who is, as you say, awakened or awakening. At the very basic level, sees human relationships in a very different way. Let me give my teacher as an example. I really, in watching and observing him, saw that the way he looked at people was different than the way I was looking at people. He saw people, first of all, as all potentially enlightened beings. So there was an immense amount of respect given to anybody, regardless of their walk or life or station or whatnot. Secondly, he saw them as kin. So he literally saw all men and women as his brothers and sisters, as his mothers and fathers, in a continuous stream of life after life. But he didn't in any way see any living being as a threat or as an object of desire. Now, I still will look at people and say, oh, they look nice, or they look good, or that person looks threatening, or whether it's for whatever the reasons you are. Maybe someone looked like that, beat you up at one time, or maybe you have racial prejudice, or whatever bias you have. Bias comes both in wanting and pushing away. We always think of bias as rejection, but bias is also in selectively gathering. And so around him, he was completely at ease, completely responsive to whoever came up. And they, in turn, felt this. And often they would just relax. People who I thought were maybe threatening or hostile or whatnot, treated in this way with both respect and a kind of kinship, just dropped all kinds of stuff. And other people that were kind of coming up to sort of flatter or to entice or allure, because he actually saw and manifested a look that said, you're my sister, you're my mother, or you're my, the whole thing just dropped. And they became very transparently artless. And that wasn't the response that I would get with some people. It took me a while to figure out, like, he was looking at everybody like brothers and sisters in the really good way. For me, I was like, well, my sister pounded on me. So if I looked at somebody as my sister, I might have an issue. But he actually manifested the awakening vision that's talked about in the Brahmanet Sutra, which are the Bodhisattva vows. And there's precepts. And there's one precept that says, the Bodhisattva, the awakened being, sees all men and women as his or her brothers, sisters, mothers, and fathers in this life, in past lives, and future lives. And also sees all elements of earth, air, fire, and water as having been, are now, or will be the composition of his or her own body. And therefore, towards all life and towards all living beings, he or she has a mind of total level equality, and actually brings forth this resolve. Not only will I not ever harm these living beings, but I should exert myself to liberate them and bring them to peace and happiness, because this indeed is me, and they, and so forth. This is actually one of the vows. And that is something you make a resolve towards to sort of push your mind in that direction, but it's also how a bodhisattva actually sees living beings and the whole of the natural world. This earth, this air, this water, this fire has sustained me, has nurtured me, will do that continuously. Therefore, I treat it as another living being, as my mother and father and so on and so forth. It's a very powerful vision, but that's how it would be different. Yeah. Okay, well, we're going to play on this a little bit tonight because, yeah.
Can you articulate the experiential difference between ceasing and suppressing, or any thought process of like when you notice that you're suppressing that you would use to sort of stop doing that rather than?
Right. So the question is the suppressing or the repressing mechanism. One, you'll feel it, and this is where the meditation practice really helps. You'll feel it physically. There's a physical referent or correspondent to repression. So the ice water is a perfect example. When there's not repression, there's a flowingness. There's an open flow to your circulation, to your blood, to your energy, to your breathing. And you're not constricted, you're not tight. There's no tightness here, there's no tightness here. In Chinese, they call it zuzai, sort of a self at ease. And this is often represented as the gentle wind blowing or the water flowing. Now, when repression occurs, a stopping occurs. And when stopping occurs, circulation is cut off, and muscles then tighten up. So repression has an actual mark, a xiang to it, which is tight, holding, constricting, pressing, and you can see it pressing down. And it leads to pressure, and it leads to stress and anxiety. So a lot of stress and anxiety we experience in our daily life is because we are trying to grasp at something and hold on to it, or to pressure and push it away. And so whether it's our jobs, our relationships, we're constantly in a state of stress because of this. So the opposite of that is a relaxed state. So that's the first reference you have. If I'm repressing, I'm going to feel that. I'm going to feel uptight. I'm going to feel constricted. You even feel your circulation in your hands and feet getting cold. You'll feel knots in this area. You'll find your breathing is broken as opposed to relaxed and flowing. And that's often the first reference you have, because sometimes it's so fast and we're so used to it, we don't even recognize it. So that's why the sitting meditation, when you're feeling pain, it's a point where there's a blockage. And that blockage ultimately goes back to a state of mind. And so you can melt through it by relaxing the mind. While you don't want to give in to it, suppose anger comes up, a real burst of anger. And the texts say, don't give in to it and let it go out, because that's feeding a fire. So you would think then, well, by stopping that, isn't that repression? No, it's just basically holding it from exploding. And then the very next thing you have to do is begin a process of untangling that, of analyzing that and seeing through it. It doesn't go away until you actually see where it's coming from. When he says, where does this come from? And sometimes anger is so fast and it's so habituated, we don't know where it's coming from. But if you're careful, in psychology they call this shaping. When I was working with severely emotionally disturbed kids, one of the ways you worked with them, they had really egregious behaviors, like violence. At the slightest thing of being dissed, if they were dissed, they would just explode in violence. And so you did what in psychology is called shaping. And by shaping, you broke the pattern down into little steps. And you just took them back one step. So before you exploded in violence, did you notice that you were clenching your fist? Oh, no. So you get them to go back in previous stages. They're not internal at all at this point. It's completely external. You were biting your lip. You figure out what those previous behaviors are before the explosion. And you get them to tune into that. When that happens, you need to catch yourself. Oh, when this happens, you need to catch yourself. Finally, over a long process, you can get them to go back and interiorize and say, a feeling, identifying a feeling arose. Oh, I mean, for them, that's an awakening. that there was a feeling that preceded this, that preceded the explosion, that preceded me busting someone. And that kind of mindfulness is what Buddhist meditation is about, but it's also used in schools to control violent reactions in kids, and part of a nonviolent way of learning to identify emotions and things as they arise. I mean, this sounds really obvious, but there's a lot of people that have no idea what's going on inside. This feeling arises, that feeling arises, they react to it and respond, and they had no idea. So you catch it, you don't let it go. At the same time, you start to just look at it. Where is this anger coming from? What preceded this? And eventually, if you're just patient with it, you don't give in to it and don't repress it, but you just say, bring it out into the light. Let's have a look at this. Let's take a look at this. It may not be pleasant, but you'll actually get to the point where you can unravel it. So it's stopping and contemplating. Shamatha vipassana. Stopping means I hold these negative things. I don't let them go. But I also contemplate. I investigate, and I take them apart and unravel them. Because stopping alone is not enough. You need both. Yeah. I don't know if that... So, yeah. Okay. So, where was I going to go tonight? So tonight we have Zhuangzi, we have the New Testament, we have Plato, and we have Walt Whitman. I'm serving up some things here. To get at this notion of everything we experience is either it's some kind of projection or some kind of interpretation that we're laying over. So the first part, although we have no good things, we're going to look at a little video. And I thought, see, I'm trying to get modern here because I know everybody's into images. So if I just go blathering on with words, everybody will fall asleep. So I'm going to add images now. So let's bring up one of the videos. And this video is a video characterization of the famous parable of the cave from Plato. Now, which one do we have there? Is that the puppets? Yeah, not the clay one. Let's do the other one. If the clay one's pretty cool, but let's do the other one. And I won't even tell you. Just watch this and listen and see how this represents some of what we were talking about.
Let me show in a parable to what extent our nature is enlightened or unenlightened. Envision human figures living in an underground cave with a long entrance across the whole width of the cave. Here they have been from their childhood and have their legs and necks chained so that they cannot move and can only see before them, being prevented by the chains from turning their heads around. Let me show in a parable.
There's no sound.
To what extent our nature is enlightened or unenlightened.
Okay, start it again. It's interesting they use the phrase enlightened or unenlightened.
Let me show in a parable.
Can you start it again?
To what extent our nature is enlightened. Let me show in a parable to what extent our nature is enlightened or unenlightened. Envision human figures living in an underground cave with a long entrance across the whole width of the cave. Here they have been from their childhood and have their legs and necks chained so that they cannot move and can only see before them, being prevented by the chains from turning their heads around.
By the way, chains is fun now.
Above and behind them, a fire is blazing at a distance. They see only their own shadows, which the fire throws on the opposite wall of the cave. For how could they see anything but the shadows if they were never allowed to move their heads? Between the fire and the prisoners, there is a raised way and a low wall built along the way like the screen which puppet players have in front of them, over which they show the puppets. Do you see men passing along the wall, carrying all sorts of articles which they hold projected above the wall? Statues of men and animals made of wood and stone and various materials? Of the objects which are being carried in like manner, they would only see the shadows. And if they were able to converse with one another, would they not suppose that they were naming what was actually before them? And suppose further that there was an echo which came from the wall. Would they not be sure to think when one of the passers-by spoke that the voice came from the passing shadows? To them, the truth would be literally nothing but the shadows of the images.
The teacher.
And now look again and see what will naturally follow if one of the prisoners is released. At first, when he is liberated and compelled suddenly to stand up and turn his head round and look towards the light, all this would hurt him, and he would be much too dazzled to see distinctly those things whose shadows he had seen before. And then conceive someone saying to him that what he saw before was an illusion. But that now, when he's approaching nearer to reality and his eyes turn toward more real existence, he has a clearer vision. What will be his reply? And you may further imagine that his instructor is pointing to the objects as they pass and requiring him to name them. Will he not be perplexed? Will he not think that the shadows which he formerly saw are truer than the objects which are now shown to him? And suppose once more that he is reluctantly dragged up a steep and rugged ascent and held fast until he is forced into the presence of the sun himself. When he approaches the light, his eyes will be dazzled, and he will not be able to see anything at all of what are now called realities. He will require to grow accustomed to the sight of the upper world. And first he will see the shadows best. Next, the reflections of objects in the water, and then the objects themselves. Then he will gaze upon the stars and the spangled heavens, and the light of the moon. He will see the sky and the stars by night. Last of all, he will be able to see the sun, and not mere reflections of it in the water, but he will see the sun in its own proper place, and not in another. And he will contemplate the sun as it is. Will he not then proceed to argue that it is the sun who gives the season and the years, and is the guardian of all that is in the visible world, and in a certain way the cause of all things which his fellows have been accustomed to behold? Clearly he would first see the sun, and then reason about it. And when he remembered his old habitation and what was the wisdom of the cave and his fellow prisoners, do you not suppose that he would bless himself for the change and pity them? And if they were in the habit of conferring honors among themselves on those who were the quickest to observe the passing shadows, and to remark which of them went before and which followed after, and which were together, and who were therefore best able to draw conclusions as to the future,
Graduate school.
do you think that he would care for such honors and glories, or envy the possessors of them? Would he not say with Homer, "Better to be the poor servant of a poor master, and to endure anything rather than think as they do and live after their manner"? Imagine, once more, such a one coming suddenly out of the sun to be replaced in his old situation. Would he not be certain to have his eyes full of darkness? And if there were a contest of measuring the shadows, and he had to compete with the prisoners who had never moved out of the den, while his sight was still weak, and before his eyes had become steady, wouldn't they all laugh at him and say he had spoiled his eyesight by going up there? That it was better not to even think of ascending? And if anyone tried to release another and lead him up to the light, let them only catch the offender, and they would put him to death.
Okay. Oh, there's more?
It is the task of the enlightened not only to ascend to learning and to see the good, but to be willing to descend again to those prisoners and to share their troubles and their honors, whether they are worth having or not. And this they must do, even with the prospect of death. They shall give of their help to one another, wherever each class is able to help the community.
Okay. We can... So, that's better than me reading you Plato, I think. There's a shorter one than the one we just saw, but and I won't go into all the others tonight. I'll save those for next week, but I want to develop this theme a little bit to, first of all, show that this idea that the nature of reality, the nature of our experience is a conditioned thing and not truth is not just in the Buddhist tradition. It runs across traditions. So next week I'll just show you a passage from the New Testament, some passages from Zhuangzi, the great Taoist philosopher, and a passage from Walt Whitman. And you'll get a sense that across the time and across these traditions, there's an underlying sensibility that in fact we are in a cave to some degree for the greater part of our lives. And the whole purpose of our struggling and longing is to somehow extricate ourselves from this condition. And the last part, of course, you can reflect on this last piece here in many ways from a Buddhist reference. Anything come to mind as you saw that? Just connections, illusion, bridges to Buddhist ideas? The idea of the Bodhisattva at the end, that the Bodhisattva returns to the cave, returns to rescue and teach, yeah. Anything else? Leaving home. Yeah, so coming out of the cave, leaving home, leaving the... and somewhat of the social disapprobation that, that goes with that. Anything else people noticed? Right, the mistaking of the shadows for reality, and he says they're illusory and they're not real, but when you're there, they seem that way. And when you first move away from them, the real seems unreal, and the shadows, by contrast, seem to be. And so this is an experience many people have as they begin to cultivate, and they get a little flavor for the new, then they're in this kind of quandary. Well, wait a minute, but this was the way it was real before, and so there's a slow transition. The eyes are not adjusted yet. And the eyes are a metaphor for insight or wisdom in the Buddhist sense, so that developing the new eyes, the eyes that see from calmness and purity and equanimity, that can take and see a great amount of light, these aren't developed yet. And so when one first encounters this, it seems like that's not true, that's not real, that's hard to look at, that's hard to face. And yet you can see the liberation that comes as his eyes adjust and he's actually freed up. Yes? Excuse me? Right. After the wisdom comes the compassion. So the compassion is born of seeing things as they really are, not just a heart feeling of pity, but an actual, clear vision, yeah. The thing that struck me is we were talking about this in our translation group, in Chinese it's called fanao, and in Sanskrit it's called klesha. And these are the fundamental obstacles that keep us from awakening. And they're sometimes translated as afflictions or defilements or pollutants, and it refers to emotional and mental and physical states that keep us in the cave, so to speak. And in the language that's used to describe them, they're called dust, shadows, chains, fetters, cankers, ropes, knots, and so on and so forth. But the chains in here, that they were chained and couldn't move, from the Buddhist point of view, would be in the state of under the klesha, that you're in the state of klesha, and therefore can only see and experience in a certain dimension towards that, and can't turn or see anything else. So again, there's just a wonderful carryover in this one, and a lot of the language we're using tonight. Okay, so we'll stop there. Next week, maybe I'll show the shorter one, because that's really more artistic. That has these clay figures, and it's got a little different spin. I'll keep trying to find stuff like this. I don't normally do this, but every once in a while now, if I search Plato, and I learned on the side there, they have like videos and images. So, my niece told me, try that, Unky, she calls me, try that. So I go, oh, that's cool. And then so I'm learning, and if I find some really good ones like this, I'll bring them in, because graphically, this really, really goes into the consciousness, I think. So we'll talk about this concept next week a little more and use some other examples. I don't know if there's any illustrations of the Zhuangzi, but if there isn't, and some of you have the talent, it'd be worthwhile doing. Because his language is rich with allegories and metaphors of animals and so forth, the frog at the bottom of the well and so forth. So we need that. Okay, so we'll stop here for tonight and pick up again on the text next week. Any lingering questions or announcements? I know the Guanyin session is starting this Sunday at the City of 10,000 Buddhas. So they'll purify the boundaries probably Sunday afternoon or Sunday evening, and they have a 7-day meditation recitation session. Anything happening here at the Berkeley Buddhist Monastery next week? That's okay. 7:30 here, a roundtable discussion, and then tomorrow night you'll have a Tomsical lecture, right? Okay, so we will do the transference. Thank you for doing the tech over there. I give you a hard time, but I couldn't do any of it, so.